Today, as we honor those who died in the service of this country, we're particularly mindful of those 8 American servicemen who most recently gave their lives in the deserts of Iran. These men joined the ranks of Americans who've sacrificed their lives on behalf of freedom. In this case, for the freedom of the American hostages still being held in Iran. Regardless of the outcome of the rescue attempt, we can appreciate the dedication of these men. Without the willingness to serve, to risk, and even to die of American military men, past and present, this day would be only a reminder of past freedoms once held, as in countries such as Poland and Czechoslovakia. And we must match the sacrifice of our military men with a dedication to maintain our military strength, whether we have to use it or not. To this end, the President and Congress must know that they can count on Americans to serve their nation in a time of crisis. As you enjoy your first holiday weekend of the summer, take a moment to think about and perhaps tell your children about the sacrifices of those who've given their greatest gift to this country, life itself. They deserve to be remembered and honored on this day. The Sonics couldn't do it twice in a row, but you couldn't have predicted they weren't going all the way by the high voltage excitement generated by the fans in the playoff series with first Portland, then Milwaukee, and finally the Lakers. The relationship between the Northwest fans and Sonics has always been a very special one, and we at Cairo have done our best to satisfy the fans by airing as many of the playoff games as possible. Of the 8 Sonic home playoff games, Cairo was able to air 6 live and the other 2 on delay. Contrast this record with some of the other playoff cities. In Houston, for instance, there were no live games, and in Los Angeles, Milwaukee, and Phoenix, there was only 1. The rest of the games were either presented as tape delays or carried on cable systems only. The difference, of course, is the Sonics organization. Because of the live television, they didn't always maximize their ticket sales, as is the practice with professional sports. But this isn't too surprising, considering the strong civic orientation of the Sonics organization. By working closely with the Sonics, Cairo's also shared their concern for serving the public, at times even bringing in network-originated games scheduled for a late night via satellite for primetime viewing. So with the completion of another successful season, actually their best yet in terms of games won, we congratulate not only the Sonics, but also the fans, whose spirit and support was an important factor in taking the Sonics as far as they went. Our compliments to the Sonics and their fans for a great season. They call it year-end buying, but it's simply a bureaucratic ruse to maintain padded budgets. You see, when a government agency looks like it's going to end up the year with a surplus fund, it goes on a spending spree in the closing weeks to avoid returning money to the Treasury. That's precisely what the General Accounting Office is accusing the Department of Housing and Urban Development of doing. In the last 8 weeks of the last fiscal year, HUD spent 47.2% of its annual budget, almost half of its total expenditures, in just 2 months. Even more, the General Accounting Office accused HUD of inflating the amount of money it was committed to spend at the end of every fiscal year since 1976. According to the department's books, HUD incurred an $18 billion increase in obligations in the last month of fiscal 78, $16.5 billion of which was to be used for low-income housing and public housing assistance. But HUD didn't stop at that. After first obligating the funds, the agency then de-obligated part of them, creating what one House member called a multi-billion-dollar slush fund. Many housing project sponsors were first advised by HUD that their programs had been tentatively approved, only to have their funds withdrawn later, completing the ruse. We think those who are ridiculing the idea that our federal budget can, in fact, be substantially reduced might want to take a look at the latest bit of financial hocus-pocus by HUD. And remember, we're talking about not millions, but billions of dollars. Interestingly enough, about the same amount as the federal budget deficit we're currently running. When the French gave us the Statue of Liberty in 1886, they gave us a legacy that has become increasingly difficult for the United States to live with. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Unfortunately, there's a limit to what even we can do for the rest of the world. With Florida nearly filled to overflowing, there seems no end in sight to the stream of Cuban refugees pouring into the United States. Estimates of the total number expected to come to the U.S. range up to 250,000 people. Add to that number the 14,000 Indo-Chinese boat people arriving in this country each month, and other immigrants, legal and illegal, arriving daily from Haiti, Mexico, and the Soviet Union and other countries. The Cuban refugees are a particular concern because the number includes a large criminal population turned out of Castro's jails. This influx of refugees puts our public services to a severe test, just as we're entering an economic recession, and at a time when we're hard-pressed to take care of our own poor and needy. Possibly it's time for the United States to close its door, at least a crack. Why should we continue to do good for the rest of the world when other countries refuse to share in the responsibility? According to international agencies, the total number of displaced refugees in the world is from 9 to 15 million people. Can the United States afford to take them all in? If not, where do we draw the line? If we hope to elevate the standard of living of those already in need in this country, we're going to have to place limits on the number of refugees we can admit. There's a limit to what we, with only 5% of the world's population, can do for the rest of the world. In the past, we've spoken out in our editorials for energy conservation as well as the development of other energy sources, including nuclear power. Some groups, on the other hand, are opposed to any use of nuclear power. Here with another viewpoint is Stephen Nesich, a spokesman for the Crabshell Alliance.
In a recent editorial opinion, Mr. Cooney stated that the risks of nuclear power have been blown out of proportion. He is totally wrong. On the contrary, we feel that the exact opposite is true. The real risks of nuclear power are much greater than is commonly believed, and the news media has failed in their responsibility to adequately inform the public of these dangers. Despite what the nuclear industry tells you, radioactive elements cannot be safely contained. They accumulate daily in our environment, leaving a legacy of cancer and permanent genetic defects for our children to live with. And what if there is a core meltdown? This accident would kill every living thing in a 50-mile radius and make most of our state uninhabitable for up to 250,000 years. Nuclear power is also an economic disaster and a consumer ripoff. The ever-increasing cost of nuclear energy is directly passed on to all of us. We are being forced to subsidize the profits of an industry that is in effect gambling with our lives. The alternatives to nuclear power and fossil fuels are numerous, and they are here today. The reason they haven't been developed is because they are not yet profitable enough for the monopolies that virtually dictate our national energy policy. We must phase out nuclear power now, before it is too late for our pocketbooks and our lives. Better to become active today than radioactive tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Nesich, for sharing another viewpoint on the use of nuclear power. Would you say government red tape has gotten a little out of hand when a college turns down a federal grant because the costs of doing the paperwork exceed the amount of the award? That's exactly what happened to Big Bend Community College in Moses Lake. Dr. Howard Friott, the Dean of Administrative Services at the two-year college, said his initial pleasure of receiving the money turned to frustration as the required forms started to arrive. Just to give you an idea of the bureaucratic red tape involved, Friott's staff was asked to comply with 12 institutional assurances, 9 special application certifications for technical assistance, energy conservation measures, 5 independent technical assistance certification requirements, 5 independent energy audit certification requirements, the financial status report SF 269 requirements, 9 general assurances and certifications, the requirements under OMB Circular A110, requirements of the Federal Management Circular 74-04, and the Notice of Grant Award. All of this just to accept a $1,000 grant for a study to reduce energy consumption. In his letter of rejection to Regional Energy Department Chief Jack B. Robertson, Dean Friott said the labor costs of completing the federal forms far exceeded the $1,000 grant. Robertson said the forms must be completed to comply with various laws passed by Congress, and while he could understand a recipient's unwillingness to deal with all the necessary forms, he pointed out it's not free money. Oh, don't we taxpayers know that? And while Big Bend Community College may not have gotten its $1,000 grant, we would hope the federal bureaucrats might learn a few lessons from Dean Fryatt, who seems to know what is and what is not a waste of energy. In a previous Cairo editorial, we said the city of Seattle was going to start enforcing an ordinance requiring dog owners to clean up their dogs' calling cards while in city parks. And we supported enforcement and suggested it wasn't too much to ask of pet owners to clean up after their pets, even on the neighbors' yards. Well, we got a lot of response, and many owners felt we were being discriminatory against dogs. Patricia McCall of Seattle wrote this: "I can't help but feel you're being totally discriminatory. No mention was made in the direction of the feline population, and shouldn't some equal type ordinance be in effect to curtail their activities? Cats are free to roam at will, unleashed to do whatever damage they choose, which is unfair, as they can create lots of chaos in a flower bed. It takes far less effort to clean up after dogs because it's in plain sight, while with cats, it's entirely another matter. What is in effect for dogs should also be true for cats. Finally, how many extra people will have to be hired to police this action at an additional expense for the taxpayer, no doubt?" And Mrs. Sandra Muat of Seattle writes this: "I would like, too, to see this cleanup law enforced all over the city, not just in parks and playgrounds. They should also apply to cats also. Cats prowling all over your premises leave their dirt and smell behind them, too. Furthermore, if the neighbors love their pets and got them in the first place to enjoy, what in the world are they doing in my yard?" And finally, Timothy Akers of Seattle writes, "I have my yard fenced, which solves the dog problem, but the neighborhood cats think it's a great place to leave their calling cards. The pet leash law should be expanded to include all pets, or someday open season may become de facto for all uncontrolled felines and canines roaming on private property where they're not wanted." A Seattle woman was stabbed to death last weekend. Charged with her murder is the son she had attempted to commit to a mental hospital. The young man had a history of mental illness and troubles with the law going back several years. He'd been committed temporarily several months ago after he assaulted his mother. Although he was under court order to stay away from home, his mother had felt sorry for him and allowed him to return. Friends of the mother and son blamed the tragedy on a system which seems to protect the rights of the mentally ill at the expense of the rest of society. The Involuntary Treatment Act requires so many hearings that concerned relatives frequently give up fighting the system. The result is that many mentally ill people are not properly treated until they commit a crime. The role of the police in handling the mentally ill is also restricted. A person suffering from a mental disorder who presents a possible danger to himself or others can be taken into custody, but he must be evaluated by a mental health professional within 12 hours or be released. This recent case in Seattle points to the need for more community mental health services. Although mandated by the legislature, funding for this program is uncertain. We support the recommendation of Jerry Smith, Deputy Prosecutor in charge of hearings under the Involuntary Commitment Act. He suggests longer periods of commitment and a longer initial holding time. Currently, a person can be held only 72 hours after a screening by a mental health professional. Unfortunately, the information needed to convince a judge that involuntary treatment is necessary can't always be put together in 72 hours. The murder of the Seattle mother, allegedly by her mentally ill son, was not only tragic, but unnecessary, but hopefully not a total waste if it brings about reform of ineffectual laws and more adequate treatment of the mentally ill. But what a terrible price to pay. All of us have been shocked and saddened by the tragic loss of lives at Mount St. Helens, a figure which may well reach 100 deaths. And that sadness has been heightened by the needlessness of many of those deaths. Remember, it was only hours before the first big blast that cabin owners had told authorities they were going into the blocked-off areas, whether they liked it or not, even threatening violence if needed to cross through the roadblocks. Volcanic experts and peace officers had been warning everyone to stay clear of the Mount St. Helens area, but in vain. They went in anyhow, ignoring the warnings, and many died horribly as a result. And what's worse, they're still doing it, sneaking through roadblocks, ignoring threats of fines and jail sentences, and endangering not only their own lives, but those who have to go in and rescue them. And the rest of us sit back and say, what in the world were they doing in there anyway? Well, there are probably a variety of reasons: curiosity, exploiters trying to make a buck, concerned friends and relatives searching for an indication of missing loved ones, but mostly all making a bad situation even worse by endangering lives, both theirs and others. Now, this is not to say that all lives lost at Mount St. Helens were needless, or that many of those who were in the area didn't have legitimate reasons for being there, for that isn't so. We're speaking of those who ignored warnings and went into restricted and dangerous areas, and those who are still doing so. Of course, some people have good reason to be close to the volcanic activity: geologists, scientists, law enforcement, and evacuation personnel. But they're there because they need to be and are performing a service. They shouldn't have to worry about those who don't have to be there. We think the time might be right to shape up those who insist on barging into restricted areas. Humanitarianism requires they be rescued when necessary. Common sense suggests that they pay for any costs associated with the rescue and spend a couple days in jail, or be assigned to cleanup squads. If warnings and roadblocks won't do it, perhaps this will. Recently, at a youth conference held at Broadcast House here at Cairo, we asked a few students what they thought of some of the subjects on which we've expressed our opinions. Here's what some of them thought about draft registration.
With regards to the draft, I think what our nation needs is more people to be patriotic. I don't think it's asking too much for United States citizens to become involved in some of the different activities that our country will take part in. And possibly what we need are citizens to become drafted into some type of service for the country rather than necessarily military service, giving the people a choice. And things such as the park services or some type of Peace Corps activity where some good can be given to other areas of the country or outside countries, and not necessarily force people to go into the military. This will open it up so that women can come into the program also, and the men can take part in this at the same time, and all Americans will share in helping our country rather than just forcing people to go into some type of armed services.
Well, I feel to just install a draft at a time where we feel that we are threatened militarily is incorrect. But I think a draft where it's continuous and a person in the Army necessarily wouldn't be a military person, but someone just serving the country in different aspects and not just militarily would be much better. And I don't think that the voluntary Army right now is very successful, and I would rather give a few years of my time, of my life, to represent our country than someone that might not be capable of doing that. And I think those are the people that are volunteering at this time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
It's a unique situation for a university to own so much property in the heart of a downtown area. But in Seattle, the University of Washington does own millions upon millions of dollars worth of prime property in the core of the city. And included in that property is the Olympic Hotel. Now, you'd think that the best possible landlord for a community would be an organization who has the community interest so much at heart. And that's why we were so disappointed in the Board of Regents of the University of Washington for their decision to lease the Olympic Hotel to a Canadian operation, which among their plans for renovation and development of the old hotel includes closing it down completely for a year and a half. In fact, for the regents of the university to allow them to do that seems to us to be a failure to consider their obligations, both to the 750 employees of the hotel and to the community which utilizes the facilities of that hotel. To make such a major renovation easier, the new operators plan on closing the hotel down completely for a year and a half. That means that the 750 employees of the hotel, currently hired by the present lessee, Western International, are going to be out of work. It also means that many civic organizations, such as Rotary and other clubs, which need larger spaces for their functions and have utilized the hotel for many years, are going to be inconvenienced. When all the plans for what to do with the Olympic were being considered, the Canadian company's plans for developing the hotel were only one of the proposals. To make an earlier renovation of the hotel possible, the current lessee, Western Hotels, had to agree to give up their present lease early so that the Four Seasons people could begin with their renovation. Well, we don't think the Western Hotels should have agreed to give up that lease without someone coming up with a definite plan on what happens to the 750 employees. Nor do we think the Board of Regents should have agreed to a year-and-a-half shutdown without a definite assurance of what happens to those 750 employees. Furthermore, we're not entirely convinced that the renovation couldn't have been undertaken without complete closure of the hotel. As we said, we just think the University of Washington, who owns the property, has a greater responsibility to the community than is being displayed by their decision to allow the new lessee to close down the Olympic Hotel for a year and a half. We're afraid it was a money decision instead of a people or community decision. Uppermost in the minds of all Americans today is last night's aborted attempt by the United States to rescue the American hostages in Iran. The mission was called off when 3 of the 8 helicopters in the rescue operation malfunctioned. While taking off from the desert refueling stop, one of the remaining helicopters collided with a rescue plane on the ground, killing 8 crewmen and injuring 4 others. In the reaction to the failed rescue attempt, some reports have mixed up the wisdom of the action with 2 other issues, the helicopter malfunction and the collision. As for the wisdom, we believe that it was time for U.S. action in Iran. As for the other issues, how was the Defense Department to know that 3 of the 8 helicopters would malfunction? The operations plan had provided that the mission would be called off if fewer than 6 helicopters were operational. The collision as well was something that couldn't have been foreseen. All non-military minds are now Monday morning quarterbacking the situation. They're judging the original decision to rescue the hostages solely on the basis of what happened and its possible consequences. We should be prepared to pay whatever consequences are necessary. When dealing with terrorists who are violating international law themselves, any well-conceived effort to rescue the hostages is justified. As Secretary of Defense Harold Brown said, Tehran is not Entebbe. The problems in rescuing the American hostages are far greater than those faced by the Israeli forces in Uganda. We have yet to hear any military expert critical of the operation. As for the non-experts, it's easy to criticize the President and his military advisors. But who has a better plan?